introduce Cary Nelson. Did I say Cary Nelson? If you've been following issues in higher education recently, you've read some of his work. There was a discussion in the New York Times, for instance, about John Yoo at Berkeley, the law professor who helped draft the torture memo, and there are questions about whether he should still be teaching there. Cary wrote a very interesting piece for the New York Times about it. He's also written recently about Yale University Press's decision to cut some cartoons out of a book, cartoons depicting Mohammed, and so he's taken a stand on that. A few years ago, you may have seen pictures of him sitting in the street with New York University graduate students who were protesting the university's decision to take away their right to unionize. He's an activist, and his scholarly work and his work with universities and with the American Association of University Professors show that. He's the Jubilee Professor of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Illinois. And as I said, he's the current president of the AAUP. His publications show his work in both of these areas, and they overlap in really interesting ways. He focuses on poetry, especially poetry of the left, and popular poetry. He has books called Our Last First Poets, Repression and Memory, Revolutionary Memory, Recovery in Poetry of the American Left. He also thinks about education and American universities in books like Manifesto of a Tenured Radical, Academic Keywords, a Devil's Dictionary, Office Hours, Activism and Change in the Academy. And he has a forthcoming book, No Campuses in Ireland, Saving Academic Freedom. I'm president of the chapter, the UVU chapter of the AAUP, and so it's a special honor to welcome the president of the American Association.
Hi.
As most of you know, the AAUP's Red Book is the Bible for universities. So as our faculty senate right now debates a policy on rights and responsibilities of faculty members, paragraph after paragraph is quoted directly from the Red Book. It's like our moral standard. It's where we get our values and well, I'll just stop there. It's our moral standard. The last thing I want to say about Dr. Nelson is he's a critic, and he's just as apt to criticize the AAUP as he is his own university. And I think that's a true test of a person's character, and we welcome you today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Scott. Scott treated me to a wonderful day yesterday that included a hike up in an aspen forest, though I had to disabuse him of his false assumption that we also have trees in Illinois. It's not true. We don't. So I'm particularly pleased to encounter them now and again, even if it takes foreign travel like a trip to Utah to generate that. And then we had dinner at Robert Redford's ski resort. I tried to buy it, but out of my price range. I wanted to thank everyone for making this visit possible. I'm just really awed by the intellectual intensity and courage of Ethics Awareness Week here. I mean, you've taken up a series of the most difficult and challenging questions that the country has faced for more than half a century, from Japanese internment to rendition. And I think you'd have quite a lot of trouble going anywhere in the United States and seeing a more intense and courageous week than that. A lot of people don't like to talk about this stuff, but these are at the core of our identity and the challenges the country has faced for, more than half a century. So permit yourself to take a little pride in what you're doing. It doesn't happen everywhere. The conjunction of the topics earlier this week with today is, I think, particularly instructive because almost every problem that we confront in higher education now situates us at the intersection of ethics and corporatization. Should we protect our lower paid colleagues from pay cuts and furloughs in the midst of a recession? Should higher paid and tenured faculty make sacrifices on behalf of community members living on the margins? What's more important, a new campus building or free health care for all campus employees? As I point out in this book that's coming out in January, the logic of corporatization suggests one answer to these questions. I think ethics suggests a different answer to each of those questions. Even, I think, our pedagogical practices, under assault for more than a decade by conservative critics, have become an ethical battleground. Political analysis and reflection, a staple of humanities and social science courses for a long time, and increasingly relevant to science studies of the environment, of global warming, and so forth, is now regularly stigmatized as unethical. That is, if you teach a science course dealing with global warming and you say there might just be some global warming out there, the right takes that as a violation of ethics for you to put forward that argument, even though it seems to be roughly a scientific consensus at this point. Instead of making those kinds of commitments in our classes, we are regularly urged to achieve some kind of uncommitted, neutral, corporate-style job training. So once again, corporatization and ethics intersecting with one another and compelling us, in effect, to take a position. And what I want to do now is to make an effort to briefly define academic freedom in the midst of the challenges that we face in the contemporary scene. In one sense, academic freedom is a kind of Platonic principle that sort of waits up there somewhere beyond human access. But in the real world, academic freedom gets defended and redefined and contextualized within history. So I want to talk just a little bit using some of my own teaching as an example of what I think academic freedom means to me. And then I want to go on and look at a series of 16 what I consider major threats to academic freedom in the United States, most of them, not all of them, most of them linked in one way or another to corporatization. I will say that in the book in which I talk about these 16 threats to academic freedom much more elaborately, I point out that in my view, my own institution, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, is guilty of violating only 15 of the 16. I also suggest in the book, and I thought I was really in trouble about this, that it was time for the president of my university to seek a life elsewhere, but yesterday he resigned, so I guess I'm protected from evaluation, from retaliation from that. Okay, in 1996, Richard Rorty, who I gather once visited here to do some bird watching, worried that faculty understanding of academic freedom had so declined that for some it represented little more than a folkway. More recently, Stanley Fish has argued that for some faculty, academic freedom is no more than a magical term that they invoke to justify unacceptable practices, by which Stanley means the practices the AAUP defends, and which, by the way, define my own teaching and research. For Stanley, it's political speech in the classroom that puts us all at risk. Eric Chaffetz, on the other hand, sees campus political speech and academic freedom as a whole as an historically produced target of opportunity. Quote, without the substantial erosion of tenure, a byproduct of the corporate model of downsizing and outsourcing, groups such as ACTA and Horowitz's Center would not pose a serious threat. In other words, neoliberal capitalism is the primary ingredient for right-wing reaction. When I debated Fish about politics in the classroom, on my campus several years ago, I described how I drew analogies in class between Vietnam-era poetry and current events. After explaining to my students what the Vietnam War was, the students had been assigned to read several anti-war poems before class. In class, I read the poems aloud, except that I substituted George Bush's name for every occurrence of Lyndon Johnson's name in the poems, and I substituted Iraqi place names for Vietnamese. Happily, passages about the earlier president's Texas machismo did not require revision. So here's a brief example from Robert Duncan's Uprising, and I'll just read my substitutions rather than the original. Now Bush would go up to join the great simulacra of men, Hitler and Stalin, to work his fame with planes roaring out of Saudi Arabia over Iraq, and men wake to see that they are used like things spent in a great potlatch, this Texas barbecue of Afghanistan, Europe, and the Middle East. And the very glint of Satan's eyes from the pit of the hell of America's unacknowledged crimes that I saw in Cheney's eyes now shine from the eyes of the president in the swollen head of the nation. My first point was a disciplinary point to demonstrate, contrary to widespread disciplinary belief, that topical poetry does not always age so rapidly as many English professors have claimed that it does. It often remains applicable to subsequent events. The second point was to raise the question of whether Duncan's certainly apocalyptic, mythic, perhaps overwrought rendering of Vietnam had any purchase on our understanding of Iraq. I mentioned that I was opposed to the war, but I hardly needed to say more. Robert Duncan, Allen Ginsberg, Denise Levertov, Robert Bly, Adrian Rich, and other poets did the work for me. Fish, on stage with me, immediately responded, "If I were Cary's dean, I would fire him immediately." I then turned to him and said, "Well, Stanley, you said that in public. It's going on the cover of my next book." He said that was fine as long as I sent him a check. I have the impression that the AAUP would come to my defense on these matters if Stanley were to be my dean and to seek to fire me. At the immediate functional level, academic freedom serves as my assurance that I can do as I choose in my teaching and research. That's a deliberately arrogant definition, and it would certainly light vengeful fires in the hearts of conservative adversaries. But in truth, that arrogance is marked by cultural, professional, disciplinary, legal, administrative, departmental, and psychological constraints that might not exhaust the list, that would take me at least a lifetime to unravel. Even my desires, that is, my conscious decisions about what I want to do not arise independently. Most of what I do in the classroom grows out of decades of disciplinary and institutional involvement. I spend the overwhelming majority of class time in the rather familiar activity of analyzing texts. The course schedule is shaped by the syllabus I write, which in many institutions like mine is a public document. And that syllabus mirrors disciplinary protocols and amounts to a public commitment that I have to honor. Now, maybe I could challenge my students better if I could dream more wildly and unpredictably than I do. But for better or worse, I am a product of my times and my experience. So doing what I choose to do in my teaching and research does not produce astonishing results, for better or worse. It's shaped by who I am, where I live, my training, and so forth. What academic freedom does is maximize my flexibility within the bounds of the professional responsibilities I have accepted. I can't devote my class on African American poetry to the study of bird migration. But the discipline admits wide latitude in what a course on African American poetry might emphasize, or what you might learn from African American poetry and apply to other subjects. In 2007, Peter Wood and Stephen Balch of the National Association of Scholars expressed in writing strong skepticism about the AAUP's assertion in our wonderful statement, Freedom in the Classroom, that a course on British Romanticism might devote some time to Harlem Renaissance poets. And the NAS said, well, if the catalog says British Romanticism, it's unethical and unprofessional to devote time to British Romantic poets. I mean, devote time to Harlem Renaissance poets. I mean, there's an ocean between them, for God's sake. Yet I often conclude a course on a particular historical period by exploring its legacy, just as I often begin one by looking at its predecessors. I don't have to do so, but I can. That right is covered by academic freedom. Now, to be sure, in a course on British Romanticism, the influence of the Romantic lyric is wide and deep. But there are many interesting reasons to unsettle student assumptions about the racialized character of influence by including, say, Harlem Renaissance poet Countee Cullen's several poems about John Keats, British Romantic poets, in a course about the legacy of Romanticism. Countee Cullen's Harlem Renaissance poems about John Keats are part of the legacy of British Romanticism. So NAS's bluster represents an argument conducted certainly in ignorance and I think also in bad faith. So long as we maintain the shared governance practices that protect academic freedom, I am myself protected from those who would police my teaching, frankly, in ignorance. Unlike the NAS, conservative critic David Horowitz doesn't specialize in skepticism. He specializes in manufactured outrage about women's studies, manufactured outrage about the excesses of leftist professors. When I last debated David at the University of Oregon in February 2008, students testified on a film shown before the debate that they actually had noted one clear example of faculty political bias: disrespect for Fox News. David allowed that this was, quote, the worst single example of political bias in the academy he had ever encountered. Obviously, I am missing something. Disrespect for Fox News for me represents the exercise of the minimal intellectual and cultural judgment required of someone willing to stand in front of a classroom. So long as those who share David's unwarranted outrage have no power over me, I can continue to express such views in the classroom or in print. Once again, I am protected by academic freedom. These functional examples don't in themselves exhaust the complexity or flexibility of the concept. The concept of academic freedom exists in differential relationship with a series of other concepts, discourses, and cultural domains. It's of necessity frequently re-articulated to new challenges, technologies, and historical conditions. It has legal, professional, institutional, and symbolic meanings that cannot easily be encapsulated by a single definition. When the AAUP a few years ago sought to adopt a slogan to promote its identity, a couple of us actually independently came up with the same suggestion. Quote, academic freedom for a free society. And that's now on our stationery. We were not, of course, then alluding to the legal status of academic freedom, which it's really only acquired since the 1950s. We were invoking its cultural and political meaning. The slogan awarded the concept of academic freedom links with other aspirational elements of American history and culture. It suggests that academic freedom has a fundamental relationship with the Bill of Rights. It asks us to reflect on how academic freedom helps us preserve our other freedoms, however imperfectly they may be realized. In an introduction to a 1990 bibliography on academic freedom, Janet Cinder observed that it's a subject with many facets. Academic freedom of public and private school teachers, of university professors, of universities themselves, and of students. William Van Alstyne warns that the AAUP's own notions of the varieties of academic freedom, like the notions of the Supreme Court, have become more complex over time, a statement that in the decades since is, if anything, even more true. Now we would really have to start making distinctions between the rights of teachers at public and private institutions and make some applications to university professors. Academic freedom as a concept and a practice has evolved over a century and more in response to changing social and political conditions, changing forms of university governments, developing case law in the courts, and of course AAUP investigations and policy statements. Now we face new threats, among them those promoted by a federal judiciary system dominated by the far right. So, my 16 current threats to academic freedom. 1, instrumentalization. The notion that higher education is little more than job training, which has taken root in many community college degree programs, provides the raison d'etre for proprietary schools and contributes toward public attitudes toward higher education as a whole. It poses several related dangers to faculty freedom to teach as they believe they should, to the kinds of research that will be supported and rewarded, to definitions of institutional mission, and to the capacity of democratic societies to promote critical citizenship. That some students may want nothing more than a career pathway from a college education does not mean that we have to submit to that view. But departments in the multiversity in some cases have already ceded all or most of their commitment to a broader educational model. 2, contingency. Higher education as a whole has doubled its reliance on contingent teachers, from graduate student employees to part-time faculty to full-time faculty off the tenure track over the last 30 years. They now do nearly 70% of all college teaching. Since most lack any real job security, they work in fear of losing their jobs. They thus have no protection from students, parents, administrators, politicians, or community members offended by what they say in the classroom or in print. Generally cut out of shared governance, they have little or no role in hiring decisions or curriculum design. Their academic freedom is at best curtailed, but many will tell you it is in fact non-existent. And if you don't think so, you should talk to some, as I have repeatedly over 2 decades, and listen to some contingent faculty tell you how they carefully design their syllabi to avoid controversy for fear of being fired as a result. And yet the colleges that rely on them and do not protect their academic freedom still hypocritically tell you that they challenge their students intellectually and politically. 3, authoritarian administration. This you won't have any experience of in Utah, but unlike most of the entries in this list, instances of college governed by administrative fiat have a long history. When a single administrator is the problem, the faculty can rise up and demand his or her replacement. But that's hardly a useful tactic when the general culture of upper administration is at stake. 4, abuses of the national security state. In the aftermath of 9/11, we've seen a whole range of very serious affronts to academic freedom justified on the basis of national security. A few faculty members have been arrested without convincing justification and held in solitary confinement. A number of distinguished foreign scholars, among them Tariq Ramadan and Adam Habib, have been prevented from attending conferences or taking up positions in the United States. Efforts have been made to institute surveillance of library usage. Warrantless wiretaps have proliferated. Federal efforts to prevent communication with foreign scholars are a very specific violation of academic freedom. Unfortunately, I don't credit myself with extreme political naivete all that often, but I just assumed that the Obama administration would rapidly overturn the restriction of access by foreign scholars to the United States, and the AAUP and the ACLU, which have worked very hard on this, have not yet succeeded in getting them to reverse those policies. And so these very interesting foreign scholars cannot come to the country to speak to us. In other cases, of course, academics have simply been drawn, like other citizens, into the extra-legal ambit of the national security state. We may see some improvements here, I'm holding my breath, but it's going to take continued vigilance, organization, advocacy, and political access to preserve academic freedom in all these areas, and that becomes a more serious statement when we recognize that the national security state is not a US phenomenon, it's an international phenomenon. 5, administration restrictions on the use of communications technology. As new technologies appear, the effort to secure them as appropriate terrains of academic freedom requires both policy work, which the AUP has done, and political struggle, which faculty members need to do on their own campuses. Administrators in the corporate university often assume traditional academic freedom does not, for example, apply to email or to college and university websites. Faculty and graduate students should have the same freedom to publish on university websites that they have in journals and books, despite widespread administration claims to the contrary. 6, unwarranted research oversight. Set up by federal regulation and intended primarily to protect the health and rights of human subjects of medical research, institutional review boards have steadily sought to expand their mission to embrace prior approval of humanities and social science research that involves interviewing or surveying human subjects. The unworkable demands IRBs have made include requirements for consent, documents to be signed by indigenous peoples who often do not have the cultural context to comprehend what they're signing. They include absurd objections to the psychological damage survey questions can cause. My very favorite example was an introductory anthropology course at my own campus where the students were, as a first step in learning how to do interviews, they were assigned to interview their parents, and the IRB blocked this because they said the faculty member hadn't taken sufficient account of the psychological damage that could be done by interviewing your parents. And I suggested that any families that had any shortage of existing psychological damage were families I hadn't really met or had much to do with recently, and I doubted if this interview would cause much additional harm. So cumbersome and intrusive IRB review procedures have had a chilling effect and caused faculty to delay or abandon research projects and lesson plans. 7, neoliberal assaults on academic disciplines. As the corporate university increasingly adopts the belief that market forces should set academic priorities, disciplines less able to raise outside funds are regularly threatened with downsizing or actual local elimination. Humanities and interpretive social science faculty are the most frequent victims as they lose the structural support they need to pursue their research and teaching commitments, interests they have long thought were safeguarded by academic freedom. My own campus 3 years ago mounted a plan to eliminate all research funding for humanities on my campus. And the chancellor, who has not yet resigned, unfortunately, but I'm hoping, approved it in secret. I found out about it, called Inside Higher Education, got them to do a story about it, and the university had to back off, and I won a few more friends in my campus administration. 8, managerial ideology. The rise of a separate class of career administrators and the substantial increase in their sheer numbers has helped fuel the belief that faculty are not full partners in the educational process, but rather resources to be controlled and managed. It's also an international phenomenon, managerial ideology. It leads to efforts to circumvent faculty governance or diminish its impact. It makes some administrators less interested in hiring full-time faculty and more willing to unbundle faculty responsibilities and hire people to serve narrow functions. And of course, managerial ideology is often the logic employed to promote corporatization and the instrumentalization of higher education. Administrators, there are now so many administrators on major campuses that they all their social life is with one another. They go to parties together. If you're a sufficiently cowed faculty member, you get invited to join them. I think it's become increasingly clear that administrators breed together and reproduce. 9, circumvention of shared governance. Shared governance reinforces academic freedom by establishing and securing the environment that sustains us. It refers to the negotiated agreements and processes that structure the relationship between the legal authority of trustees and the professional expertise of faculty. Because the trustees, the Board of Regents, board of governors, whatever, do have legal authority over these decisions. And in effect, what shared governance is the series of negotiated relationships in which the board says, actually, you, the faculty members, know more about designing the curriculum than we do, and so we agree to cede that authority to you. You have the expertise necessary to hire other faculty members. We cede that authority to you. AAUP has defined shared governance in a series of documents issued since 1920. 10, globalization. Globalization is an historical, political, and economic process that not only impacts higher education, but also opens opportunities which themselves transform its character. As universities seek to market their product in other countries, and now to establish satellite campuses abroad, they may be tempted to abandon the standards and structures that support academic freedom and shared governance in their home institutions. Tenure and full-time employment with benefits may appear like unnecessary expenses, threats to the revenue streams, when a campus that honors those values here sets up a satellite campus elsewhere. International capital frequently sees higher education either as an investment opportunity or as a sheer service industry for international finance. The AEP just this year issued a statement on that and basically urges faculty members at the home institution to monitor the application of standards to these satellite campuses. I mean, that's really a responsibility you have to take yourselves and make sure that the university honors abroad the same principles that obtain here. 11, opposition to human rights. If healthcare, a living wage, vestment and retirement systems, safe working conditions, and the right for employee groups to bargain collectively are basic human rights, and the UN says they are, then those universities that deny them has ceased to be admirable or ideal institutions. Many of the values higher education has traditionally promoted, from free inquiry to a commitment to the public good, cannot remain credible if a university adopts the employment practices of a ruthless corporation. 12, inadequate grievance procedures. Many colleges and universities, including my own, have inadequate or largely non-existent grievance procedures for faculty. Academic senates overall do not actually have a very good record at handling individual examples of violations of academic freedom. And too often the only appeal is to the very administrator responsible for the offense. The increasing number of part-time faculty without tenure has made it even more important to institute grievance procedures that can protect academic freedom. Unfortunately, that will most often not happen outside collective bargaining. 13, the only one of the 16 of which my own campus so far is innocent, religious intolerance. Both here and abroad, there are colleges and universities so consumed with their sense of doctrinal certainty that they really do not honor an acceptable standard of free inquiry. Some are essentially colleges and universities in name only. The fact that faculty and students willingly and happily, in some cases, accept extreme restrictions on speech does not change the expectation that higher education should challenge fundamental beliefs. An argument that perhaps you have encountered in this state from time to time, and that such institutions may not do so. Religious fundamentalism, whether in the US or Iran, poses a serious threat to academic freedom. And there are, of course, many religiously affiliated schools in the United States that do honor academic freedom, but not all of them. 14, political intolerance. Political intolerance is also an international phenomenon. In the United States, it's been promoted by the renewed culture wars of the last decade, with the right wing's well-funded special focus on classroom speech and campus life. But in specific university settings, from political meetings to department meetings and hiring committees, political intolerance can come from either the right or the left, and it does come from both the right and the left. Something that the left has had a lot of trouble admitting over the last generations, but which I nonetheless believe to be true and have tried to argue in the book. Certainly further terrorist attacks on American soil would decrease public support for campus-based dissent. Yet the need for the campus as a place for passionate but reasoned debate, as a home for the loyal opposition, has rarely been greater. 15, legal threats. The federal courts are threatening to curtail both academic freedom and shared governance, specifically at public rather than private institutions. Unless the courts prove willing to carve out a special status for faculty, their current tendency to reinforce the authority of the state in its role as an employer will sweep up the faculty in its wake. And this could leave faculty speech rights massively undermined. I think the AUP is about a week away from issuing a major statement, sort of 50-page document on the legal challenges to academic freedom that have mounted over the last 5 or 6 years. 16, claims of financial crisis. The recession gives administrators the opportunity to claim financial crisis whether or not it is true. Their plans often demonstrate they do not share the same values, priorities, loyalties, goals, and sense of mission as the faculty. Deciding how to deal with either real or imagined financial constraints, as I was pointing out at the opening, entails fundamental moral and ethical issues. How well schools deal with these ethical challenges, whether they're even willing to address them, may depend on how staffing and compensation have evolved over the last 2 generations. Put it bluntly, an institution that pays its president and football coach $500,000 a year or more, an institution that has bought into huge disparities between salaries for humanities and business faculty, an institution that already pays contingent faculty what are literally sub-minimum wages, is probably going to be ill-prepared to address the ethics of employment in a crisis. In other words, if you already have a completely unethical compensation system in place, what are the odds that you can look at the current financial crisis and ask how to respond to it ethically? Small. Nothing is more disingenuous in the context of what I would call an amoral salary schedule than an administrative declaration that we all have to share the pain equally. If the worldwide recession continues, many institutions are going to face a fundamental ethical choice, whether to exacerbate or to ameliorate pay schedules and working conditions that are wholly unfair. Should campuses now reap the fruits of gradually enhanced exploitation, or should they take this as an opportunity to address them? In any case, the question is always, despite a hell of a lot of faculty complaining to the contrary, the question is always how you spend the money you have, despite so many faculty across the country wailing that there isn't enough money. The issue to face is how you spend the money you have and whether you are spending it ethically. That requires broad campus-wide consultation. Otherwise, both shared governance and academic freedom will suffer. There is one and only one solution to these problems: collective action. Reconceive faculty identity to embrace both careerism and community responsibility. Then act. The university is now being subjected to sustained political, cultural, and economic assault. To deny that is to cede the future to corporatization and a form of higher education with little purchase on cultural critique and little basis to claim that the university is a special site of ethical obligations, often different from the commercial world. To theorize the contemporary corporate university is to recognize there was nothing inevitable about its formation. It did not have to come to pass, and it can still be dismantled. Now, this may seem a little bit peculiar here, but not so much in the wider world. Set a $200,000 limit to faculty salaries, and I said it would seem a little strange. I mean, there are business professors in Illinois earning $500,000. as long ago as 8 or 9 years ago, assistant professors of dermatology were earning $1 million a year. I haven't checked to see what they're earning now, so yeah, I know it ain't so here, but the limits I'm proposing will have to have real world applicability. They're not going to have a lot of impact locally. Set a $200,000 limit to faculty salaries and a $300,000 limit to upper administrative salaries on a 9-month basis. Limit coaches, a particular challenge, to $300,000 as well. In my institution, the executives working for the president, that is the president's assistants, earn more than $300,000 each. And some of them have a 20-year history of unbroken, wretched, destructive, and foolish decisions. For that, they tend to get bonuses. I'd cut their salaries by 50%, redirect the money saved to hiring assistant professors, raising part-timer salaries to parity, and graduate student employees' wages to the cost of living, eliminating all tuition payments for poor and lower middle-class students. Deny administrators the right to fund gratuitous pet projects at the expense of a principled, ethical campus salary schedule. If administrators refuse to comply, sit in their offices, sit in front of their cars, block campus streets, block access to buildings, picket their houses. Asked how to put that into practice by faculty members at another university, I said, all night long, picket the house and chant, "We love you." Use nonviolent civil disobedience to force change. Or if that seems too confrontational, form a union or strengthen your AAUP chapter and begin negotiating these demands. A strong AAUP chapter can be just as effective without collective bargaining as with collective bargaining. There are schools in the United States that do not have collective bargaining, but do have a very high percentage of faculty members in their AAUP chapter, and the presidents sit down and negotiate salary and working conditions and everything else with an AAUP chapter. That's all it takes, is the power of numbers and the power of leaderships. The key decisions about the job system and the academic workplace are made on your own campus when budget priorities are set and governance practices established. Take the money and the role in decision-making in your own hands. You have nothing to lose but your chains. As the AAUP has argued for nearly 100 years, academic freedom cannot survive without job security and without shared governance. Thanks. So happy to take questions, comments. I'll switch to my other pair of glasses that lets me see you. Yeah.
Well, if Stanley Fish becomes your dean and fires you, I hope you'll apply for a position here.
There you go.
I wonder...
As long as you can help prevent the fire in the lovely Aspen Canyon where I would want to live. Go ahead.
But I don't think we can get $200,000 for it.
Will you take a quarter of that?
No, I definitely think the salary should be capped at $200,000. Greed shouldn't be a part of this appointment. Actually, about 8 years ago, my wife was about to be offered a named chair at UC San Diego. And I always advise people in these negotiations not to bring up the partner until kind of like almost everything is settled. So at the very end, she said, by the way, I have a partner. I said, oh, who was he? Cary Nelson. So she was in a communications department. He said, well, let me go to the literature program and see if they'd be interested. They were. And then they went to the dean, and the dean said, absolutely no way. So I thought, well, I'll just see how bad this is. And I said, well, what if Paula got the job and you just hired me to teach one course per year as an adjunct? Would that be acceptable? Mind you, 26 books and 200 articles. No, we would not even hire you as an adjunct. So then, the $50,000 you're offering me may look pretty good. Then the department head came back to me and said, the donor of the named chair is still alive, really wants this position filled. What about if instead of offering you a job, we bought you a house in San Diego? And I was offended. And I thought, well, I don't want to move out there basically with the police watching for me to appear on campus. So I said no, but now I have a lot of second thoughts about that. I mean, the house in San Diego might, I mean, how many years of teaching would I have to do to pay for that? So anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm wondering if you see there a threat to academic freedom represented by situations where a faculty member uses academic freedom to justify something where maybe it's not appropriate. And for just one example, I've had a faculty member request a certain teaching schedule which I wasn't able to honor for various reasons, and they accused me of violating their academic freedom.
Doesn't apply, academic freedom doesn't apply to what courses you get assigned.
Right, yeah, that was my argument, but
right.
no, I have the right to teach what I want, when I want.
The AAUP is already in writing saying that it doesn't apply to what, if they tell you to teach a course, you got to teach the course. I mean, you can negotiate, you can talk about it, but you don't have the authority to demand to teach a particular course, nor do you have the authority to stay in a particular course if you're judged not to be fit to do it. I mean, academic freedom is not an open
right, but
warrant.
I think it can weaken it on a campus if it gets thrown around and used loosely to attempt to justify things where it really isn't appropriate.
This came up for me in a way, I guess just about a week ago, because I did a piece in Inside Higher Education about Neve Gordon, the Israeli faculty member at Ben Gurion University, who did a piece in the Los Angeles Times at the end of August 23rd, I think. My memory's not that good, but something roughly like that, urging a worldwide economic boycott of Israel. And his dean, basically 3 days later, wrote a companion piece also in the LA Times, saying that he had proven himself unfit to teach at the university. It was time for him to leave, that they couldn't fire him, but that they would seek alternative forms of disciplinary sanction against him. So I did a piece saying, and he's a department head there, okay? And I did a piece saying the dean has every right to remove him as a department head for anything. They could remove him as a department head because they don't like the way he dresses. They could remove him as a department head for the very reason that she offered, that he was offending their major American donors. A department head doesn't serve in that position sustained by academic freedom. A department head is an at-will employee. They want you out, you're out the next day. There were a number of international protests saying that removing him as department head would violate his academic freedom, and the AAUP, and certainly I as well, and I wrote and said, if she decides to remove him as department head, she has my support. That's her right. Academic freedom doesn't protect him in that role. It does protect him against being fired, but not against that administrative role. So there are a lot of distinctions like that that are just not well understood, and I think we all have to work harder at trying to get people to understand them. It's not the other case, which is now coming up repeatedly, and I think it always does, is whether academic freedom protects you from outrageous extramural statements, that are statements made in the public domain. And there the AAUP draws very fine distinctions that are also hard to get people to recognize. For example, there's an engineering professor at Northwestern University in Illinois. His last name is Butts. Off campus, he's a very aggressive Holocaust denier. The AAUP's position is that his Holocaust denial has no bearing on his capacity to be an engineering professor. He's very careful not in his engineering classes to say anything about the Holocaust. But when he, in a newspaper or whatever domain, he'll tell you the Holocaust doesn't exist. Academic freedom protects his right to make any public statements that he wants, as long as they don't call into question his competence in his area of disciplinary expertise. So, if he wants to be an idiot about historical subject which I believe to be factually disprovable, that the Holocaust doesn't exist, he's free to do that because it doesn't impact on his standing as an engineer. And thus with Neve Gordon's a political scientist, he has the right in the public domain to advocate for sanctions against his own country. In fact, he's exercising his judgment as a political scientist in the public domain to make those statements. So those are doubly protected, in part because it's an expectation that a faculty member apply his or her disciplinary expertise to public education and public policy, which is what Neve Gordon is doing. Of course, we have not had a perfect record of protecting academic freedom during wartime. I mean, that's the hardest time for a country to protect the values of free speech. It's often the most important time to try to stand up for your principles. We obviously didn't protect the First Amendment for Japanese Americans interned during the Second World War, and you just had a session talking about that here on campus. We often fail, but both for the public, whose free speech rights are essential, and for academics whose extramural statements are critical to their ability to act freely on campus, academic freedom has to protect those. But if you make statements in the public domain that suggest you're ignorant about your own discipline, then you're in trouble. We don't protect it. So if an historian, unlike the engineer, were to go out and say the Holocaust is a myth, then the history faculty could well say, sorry, you don't understand the 20th century. We can't have you teaching in a history department because you're ignorant of the facts. So it doesn't protect, academic freedom would not protect statements that call into question your disciplinary expertise. That's a long answer, but I think that those are distinctions that people really would benefit from understanding. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I teach web development, which has lots of ethical gray area kinds of things.
Multiplying.
And it's funny how when I pose a discussion question to students, very often they hesitate, they think, oh, they just need to repeat my original proposal. They don't, look at all sides, and it's very difficult to get my students to say, this is a gray area. It's not right or wrong. You need to decide, given a certain situation, how you're going to handle this. And to get my students to be brave enough to do that, I'm so scared, that they hesitate doing that. But
You just have to be non-threatening like me.
how do you deal with faculty who I think abuse this notion of academic freedom in order to build themselves up as an authority and to use that authority over their students?
First of all, I spend about 50 pages on that exact question in this book. So you just need to buy a copy as soon as it appears. But absolutely, on my next trip. Look, that's the first thing to say. I think the most important thing that I can say to you, and it may be difficult to hold on to this distinction. You have an absolute right as a faculty member to lay out what your particular pedagogical ethic is. So if you decide that how you want to teach is to present neutral, if you can, positions on both sides of a question, and then urge your students to decide and never reveal what your own opinions are, that is absolutely your right. You have another right to do as you just did, to try to urge other faculty members to adopt that same ethic. That is, you have a right to promote your pedagogical ethic on campus and argue for it. Where the right stops is firing a faculty member or penalizing a faculty member who doesn't share your particular ethic. So you have a right to stand up for yourself. You have a right to promote your values. You don't have a right to impose them on others. What the AEUP says about this, and if you read our statement, Freedom in the Classroom, which is on our website, although our website has the worst search engine on planet Earth, the secret, the staff really gets pissed at me if I say, look, you want to find something on the AEUP website, use Google. don't use our search engine. They say, you shouldn't say that. I say, well, you know, a lot of frustrated people out there. What we say is that advocacy for a certain point of view can be part of the valid intellectual life. In other words, you as a faculty member, if you wish to, can make a case for a particular perspective and urge your students to listen to it. And experiencing some faculty members doing that is a helpful part of an education that prepares students to be advocates in their own domains and in their future adult life. From time to time, they should hear faculty members arguing persuasively for a particular position. What you can't do is impose that position on your students. And if faculty members step over that line and they demand that their students echo their opinions, then they are in violation of student rights. And we are in print with, I think, the best statement on student rights ever written in 1967. That too is on our website, where we explicitly say that students have to be protected from that kind of coercion. I mean, I don't think there's a belief about anything that I hold that I don't let my students know. That's just the way I am, right? It's out there. And I also make it clear that if they take alternative positions and argue them well, they get extra credit for it from me. I mean, that's what I want. I want a debate in the classroom. I don't want to be bored when I go in there. I want differences of opinion. So it is quite possible to let your own views be known and at the same time tell them if they have different points of view, you know, God love them, do it. Argue for it, you know, fight for it in the classroom. That's the kind of atmosphere I create. And frankly, I don't give a damn whether they agree with me or not. They take my class, then they get on with their lives. Maybe some of them remember that they had the class, maybe some of them don't. What difference does it make to me whether they share my opinions or not? If I could, you know, get 300 million Americans to share my opinions, that would be something. But do I care whether 25 undergraduates do or don't? It has no impact on the country, it has no impact on anything, really, except their own lives. So, you know, where you step over the line is where you try to coerce them to share your opinions. Now, it takes hard work to be able to both express your political views or your views on policy issues or whatever, and still make it clear that you welcome them expressing alternative opinions. But you don't have to do that. You can also do the neutrality thing and try to present it that way. What that means is devising your own ethics of pedagogy. The best I can do, at least briefly, yeah.
I had an experience here in a history class, political science class, a couple years ago, where I was in class and we were talking about the history of the U.S. Constitution. And the teacher started with the Old Testament and kind of created this idea that there's of a biblical history of the U.S. Constitution, as opposed to talking about the Magna Carta or a history of Republican rights in Great Britain or elsewhere in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be frank, by excluding other points of view, is that a type of coercion? By not sharing the alternative idea that there's been a long secular history of rights and constitutional ideas, is that a type of coercion?
Well, I mean, I won't attempt to evaluate the relevance of kind of biblical influence of the Bible on our own views of human rights and so forth. You know, I think there probably is a relationship between advocacy of some values in the Bible and advocacy of values in American democratic history. Complex subject. I mean, off the hand, do I think that would be the most, to exclusively talk about the lineage of biblical influence, would be doing the best possible job of teaching the history of the ideas and the discourse behind the Bill of Rights and the US Constitution? Probably not. Would I penalize them for it? No. If a department felt that that really seriously misrepresented the nature of what that course should be, then a department could remove a faculty member from the course and assign him to something else, which happens all the time. I mean, sometimes, faculty members have such a, monomaniacal view of a particular area that you're better off like moving them over to something else where they can, have a little more detachment from subject matter. That's the kind of thing that a department can do. It can move a faculty member around and try to place him or her in a better context. I mean, I think another thing the AEUP says is, on most significant matters that you study at the university, what you hear in a particular course is not going to be the be-all and the end-all of everything you learn. I mean, okay, you don't have a radio, you don't have a television set, you never read newspapers, you never talk to anybody, maybe the course is all you've got. But on many subjects that we confront, students encounter a whole wide range of different opinions and a whole range of different settings. They'll hear different talks on campus that take up a variety of points of view. So, it's not as if a classroom is a kind of drugged indoctrination session and it's the only thing on the table that you actually hear on major issues. People are exposed to a variety of points of view. Sometimes, by the way, one of the things I argue in the book is that there are faculty members that I would never ask to present both sides of an issue because I think they would do a lousy job of it. And it's in those situations, I really think it's sometimes better to just let the faculty member take his or her point of view and express it, as long as they don't impose it on the students, and some do, in which case they should be penalized. But if, let's just say you're teaching a course on the Middle East, and you either have strong endorsement of a Palestinian cause, let's say you believe that a two-state solution is impossible, there has to be one common state in the Middle East, or you have strong Israeli loyalties, and you believe that in the extreme case that there's biblical warrant to have control over Judea and Samaria. I'm not sure that either of those two people who hold such positions, it would be really helpful to have them try to present both sides of the case. I mean, I think I'd just rather have them ride their own hobby horse, present it in front of the students, let the students hear that point of view, because they're not going to be capable of doing the job adequately. I'd rather they get the alternative view from someone else who holds that opinion or who is capable of giving a balanced perspective. And in the course of time, you're not likely, at this point in planet Earth, not to be exposed to a variety of opinions about the Middle East. I mean, again, unless you're not reading or listening to anything, you're going to hear a wide range of opinions. So a particular class doesn't have to do it all for you. And I just don't think, believe me, I've talked to a lot of people about that issue, and I run into a lot of people who are just not faculty, who are just not up to the job of presenting both points of view. And I'm sure it would be true even about global warming. You're not going to have, if you believe deeply that global warming is a reality, you believe deeply that it isn't a reality, maybe you're not going to be all that good at presenting both points of view. So realistically, that's what I'd say. Yeah.
A lot of issues related to academic freedom have to do with institutional organization. I'd like to hear what you have to say with regards to a hierarchical structure in which the administration and the faculty would all be in one branch versus a structure in which you might have an academic branch and an administrative branch with specific roles and responsibility that are significantly different, or perhaps even a combination or both.
Some kind of combination seems to me most reasonable, given the limitation that I said that I laid out initially, which is that the board and through the board, the administration, which basically exists in a relationship of line item authority, does have legal control over much that goes on at the university. And it takes willingness of those who have that legal authority to be willing to let go of some of it and to make contractual arrangements that cede it, in some areas, the final authority to the faculty. And that ceding of final authority seems to me essential. I mean, all through my career, I've known administrators that I tremendously admired. I went to a small liberal arts school, Antioch College, back in the 1960s, where disciplinary action was decided by a joint faculty-student committee. I consistently felt that the disciplinary decisions they made were excessive and outrageous. They seemed willing to hang people for minor offenses. And it was always the administrators who stepped in with a kind of perspective from human decency and said, you know, we don't need to extract such a severe sentiment, and overruled the student faculty discipline bodies. So, you know, administrative authority, even to overrule what appear to be more democratic processes, can sometimes be a good thing. You know, especially if you have philosopher kings and queens as administrators, rather than former CEOs. Unfortunately, we seem to be going the other way. I mean, I think there are a variety of administrative structures and structures that empower faculty and even student decision-making that can be evolved to produce a cooperative working relationship. My choice is always to work cooperatively with administrators. It used to be, on my own campus, there was a kind of basic administrative principle that the aim of the administration was to improve the quality of all departments on campus. And that sometimes meant tough decisions about where to put resources and where not to put resources, but there was a basic assumption that, you wanted to improve the humanities, you wanted to improve the sciences, you wanted to improve the social sciences, that broad mandate was part of administrator identity. Now on my own campus, where they propose eliminating all research funding for the humanities, so you wouldn't even get tripped to one conference a year, I got a little more problem with that kind of ideology that's much more managerial and economic profit oriented. And I also think that, American higher education is incredibly diverse. One of our strengths is, we're never all going to be all the same. Between small liberal arts schools and huge multiversities, secular institutions, religious institutions, public institutions, private institutions, no single form of governance is going to work for all that range of people. Where I went to a small college, there were 125 faculty. They often got together in meetings. They could talk about the curriculum as a whole. They could reach unity in the faculty itself about educational policy. My university has nearly 3,000 faculty members. Getting them all together in one space other than the football stadium would probably be difficult. Getting them to talk to one another in a rational and civil fashion, getting them to reach agreement on anything, forget it. It's just not possible. So, whatever kind of governance system a huge institution like mine is going to put in place, it's not going to have the same kind of potential to build consensus as you might in a small liberal arts college or a smaller comprehensive university. So, the governance structures, there's no one size fits all for American higher education governance, given the incredible diversity of institutions we have, which we're lucky for. Believe me, in countries that have only like one kind of institution or have centralized government control over college and university funding, and that ranges from a lot of countries we know well and think we respect. Britain, Australia have much more centralized funding for higher education, and I prefer the sloppy diversity that we have. So long as we honor principles of academic freedom and shared governance as best as we can. Someone else? Yeah, hi.
This made your list, but I was wondering, in a place where you don't have collective bargaining, what would be the best model for grievance for a faculty member against a department chair or a dean or something like that, where they feel like every step up, they're they're hitting a brick wall.
Well, one word, or I guess it's more than one, an elected grievance committee rather than an appointed grievance procedure. I mean, I think if the very people, administrators who are likely to commit the grievance, appoint the committee that reviews the grievance, not so good. That committee should have abandon hope all ye enter here over its doorway, because that's what your situation is. So I think you need, even if there's not collective bargaining, you can have a mechanism for the faculty with a secret ballot to elect a grievance committee. And therefore, at least you can have at least some confidence that it has independence from an administrative structure. That's the first step. And the people on the committee should not have any administrative appointments in the central administration. They need to be as independent as they can be. That said, I've just...
Would the faculty senate be the right place for the election of that kind of committee?
I don't think so. I think it should be the faculty as a whole. I mean, I don't... A lot of faculty senates have no spine. I mean, for example, a lot of them, mine hasn't for years. The last 3 years, it finally has discovered courage. You know, I don't know if it saw The Wizard of Oz or what, but it's finally stood up for itself a bit. But historically, it's been a rubber stamp for the administration. It's been historically the AAUP chapter locally has sort of acted as the Senate's whip. That is, it exposes issues, it takes clearly argued stand on a principled basis, and sometimes gets the faculty senate to do something when it would just never do anything on its own. So because faculty senates often have such a close collaborative relationship with the administration, I don't think they're a good place to hold that election for a grievance committee. I think it should be the faculty as a whole that have a right to have that election. People should make statements and so forth, and you can be familiar with people's history on campus.
Who would provide the leadership to make that coalesce, that process coalesce?
Well, the administration can conduct the election. I mean, the administration can conduct the election, secret ballots. I mean, that's part of the administration's job to facilitate that sort of shared governance process. And that's just better than an appointed committee. An appointed committee is really bad. I mean, I've seen, appointed committees are increasingly being used around the country as a way of, as an end run around shared governance. Because if you appoint the right committee, you get the results you want, and that's the end of it. But it has a veneer, an appearance of disinterest when it simply doesn't have disinterest at all. That's very common administrative procedure. The AEUP recommends elected committees for all decision-making regarding faculty status. Elected tenure and promotion committees, elected appeals committees, elected review committees, all of that. It's not a perfect guarantee. I mean, an elected group of faculty members can mess up, happens all the time, but at least it has a degree of clear independence from the ordinary processes of disciplinary sanctions. It's the best we can do. Now, that said, I've asked the AEUP, and they've agreed, the organization has agreed to form a committee. I'd hoped it would be started by September, but September is, the hourglass is running out, so it's going to take a little longer, to ask a series of very specific questions about how universities should respond to outside political attacks on faculty members. What kinds of committees do there have to be to review them, and what kinds of levels of expertise the faculty members have to serve on that committee? What kind of disciplinary expertise should a faculty member have to serve on a committee to respond to complaints from outside the university? In many institutions, and this is really weird, you get more disciplinary expertise reviewing your tenure case than you do a criticism post-tenure of your extramural political statements. And the Churchill case, not too far away from Utah, is a pretty good example of that, of a review committee responding to external complaints that didn't have disciplinary expertise on it. Right? So you get, it's really weird to say that as an untenured faculty member, you get your tenure reviewed, by people who kind of understand your field. And if you're already tenured and you're going to have a post-tenure review, you can get your work reviewed by people who know nothing whatsoever about your discipline. So something's wrong there, and I think the AUP has to set out much better standards for disciplinary reviews of scholarly and extramural statements after you've received tenure. So maybe one thing the AUP doesn't do is move quickly on much of anything. So it'll probably be at least another year or a year and a half before this committee is formed and gets to do its work. But hopefully we'll issue something on that particular problem area sometime in our lifetime.